At this point, we have our keynote speaker for after the coffee break, and his name is Mr. Steve McGuirk. He's from the county fire. He's a county fire officer and chief executive of the Greater Manchester Fire and Rescue Service. Steve is with us today by video conferencing. Steve was one of the UK's youngest chief fire officers when appointed in 1999. He's at the forefront of the transformation of the UK fire and rescue services, having led two of the fire and rescue services widely recognized as being the leading edge of change in recent years. Awarded the Queen's Fire Service Medal in 2001 and the CBE in 2004 in recognition of his thrust for change and improvement in the UK. Steve was elected to the board of the Chief Fire Officers Association in 2001, and then elected to lead the Professional Association as president in 2006. And he was also a member of the presidential team until 2008. He currently leads for the CFOA on Resilience Matters. Steve will present for us today through video and conferencing, and he will discuss fire and technology in the 21st century. What I'm going to do, because he can't see me, I'm going to go to the back of the room so he can see all of us. And what I will do is ask him questions after his presentation from back there. So you cannot see me, but you can hear me, because I think it's only fair that I'm off to the side and he can't see me. So we're going to have a camera on me and all of you. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, please let us give a warm welcome from the UK to Mr. Steve McGuirk. Welcome, sir.
Thank you. Okay, good morning, everybody. Really, it's a great pleasure to be able to talk to you today. It's a rainy Manchester. Hopefully, the technology holds up for the next 20 minutes or so. What I want to do today is three things. Firstly, I want to say a little about my organisation and the city region of Greater Manchester. I think this is very helpful to set the context for then, secondly, touching upon the first wave of transformation we've been through in the UK, but especially in Greater Manchester, before finally talking in more detail about the second wave of transformation that we are currently living through, and how we are trying to use the financial crisis of the last few years, and of course the next few years, to fundamentally redesign and reconfigure our service, and indeed the way we fight fires. We believe that the changes we are making in Greater Manchester are really exciting, and for us they represent a true step change. And so we also believe that there is huge learning for everyone, and potentially there are global ramifications, and hopefully you will get a sense of this from the presentation. Of course, the paper will be available to delegates after the conference, and if anyone wants to learn more, or indeed even visit us for yourselves, please feel free to do so. My email and contact details and Twitter account will be made available. Okay, let me say a little about Greater Manchester. Unlike some of the other cities in the UK, I think everyone will have heard of Manchester as home to the greatest football team ever to grace the planet. I know that isn't Sheikh Mansour's Manchester City, it is of course the other side of town, Manchester United. But Manchester is so much more than the home of football. It is a key part of the UK's social and economic history, but also a key plank in its future. Greater Manchester covers an area of around 500 square miles with a population of over 2.6 million people, which is increased by 100,000 student population and can increase by a further 5 million people within commuting distance for work and leisure purposes. Greater Manchester is considered the regional centre for the northwest of England, which of itself is extremely varied in nature and risk and includes many urban areas as well as other cities such as the city of Liverpool, with high density population and social issues alongside suburban residential areas. And the northwest of England also has many rural areas with national parks such as the Lake District, and also many miles of coastline. I should add that Greater Manchester is landlocked. The area then is best described as a city region and continues to grow and evolve. Manchester has a powerful history, and we have led the world in a number of ways, and I think this is important to understand when I talk later about what we're doing in the fire and rescue service here. In other words, we're not afraid to be pioneers. The Bridgewater Canal, part of the amazing canal system that evolved across the UK from the 1700s, reached Manchester in 1761, driven by mechanisation, industrialisation and the expansion of the cotton industry. And this placed Manchester at the commercial heart of both the textile industry but also the wider industrial revolution for well over 100 years. The city then diversified during the early 20th century, but as the UK's industrial decline set in during the post-war period, Greater Manchester became something of a casualty, with that decline intensifying during the 1970s and accelerating during the recession and economic policies of the early 1980s. Whilst the UK developed much more as a service sector economy, particularly financial services, this was predominantly around London and the southeast of the country, which left Greater Manchester, alongside other regional cities, falling behind. Although a reconfiguration and regeneration programme had already begun by the 1990s, it was a major terrorist attack by the IRA during the football tournament Euro 96 that marked a turning point for the city's redevelopment. Whilst the bomb decimated the city, it created both a desire and an opportunity to rebuild the buildings and also rebuild the economy. And really, from the period of the mid-1990s, the city has gone from strength to strength. So here are just a few things you may not associate with Manchester, but illustrate very well that sense of entrepreneurialism and that pioneering spirit I mentioned. The world's first train station was constructed in Manchester. Mr. Rolls first met Mr. Royce at the Midland Hotel in Manchester. And Apple computers are suggested to be so called because of a Manchester resident, Alan Turing, who is considered to be the father of modern computers, as all computer programs only exist because of his Turing machine. He was named by Time magazine as one of the most 100 influential people of the 20th century. But Turing was also homosexual, which in those days was illegal. And so he was prosecuted in 1952, ending his career and ultimately his life 2 years later, when in 1954 he committed suicide by injecting an apple with cyanide and eating it. So Apple Computer's logo remains that of an apple with a bite out of it in commemoration of Turing. And Greater Manchester matters to the economy. It accounted for 70% of all population growth across the northwest in the last 10 years, reversing decades of population shift in the opposite direction. Okay, hopefully this brief history and outline of the city region provides a helpful context to understand our size, our pedigree of pushing boundaries, and our preparedness to take forward new thinking that can literally change the world. So let me move on to talk about us, fire matters, and our transformation. Greater Manchester Fire and Rescue Service is the second largest fire and rescue service in England. Only London is bigger. Our budget is around 110 million sterling, and we have over 2,000 staff. Not surprisingly, given the picture I've painted already, we manage a very complex range of risks across the widest spectrum, including major sporting stadia, heavy industry, and transport infrastructure, with many complex health and social issues to complement the economic and risk issues. Some of these will be very similar to those in UAE, and some, of course, will be different. Nevertheless, I think there is learning for all in relation to how we go about change. In the early 2000s, a constellation of major factors came together in the UK, and in quite a short period of time, that propelled us onto a wave of transformation. And I want to explain these a little more, because innovation and change are so often talked about as a nice, neat, linear and strategic approach, but in reality are often much more a messy, knee-jerk response to a rapidly changing world. The first of these key factors spanned a period of nearly 2 years, and it was the industrial dispute of 2002-2003. This was a very bitter dispute over pay and terms and conditions that became protracted and deadlocked over a number of months, with the trade unions and the government each adopting very entrenched positions, such that it became very high profile, very public, and a highly politicised dispute. So much so that the only way the government could break the deadlock was to commission an independent review of the service, and the review took place in the last half of 2002, leading to the publication of what we call a white paper, which is really an expression of government policy the following year. The white paper then became law in 2004. But the review was also informed by two other key phenomena that are relevant to everyone and very much shaped our thinking, and I'm sure are still shaping yours. The first of these was the terrorist attack on the Twin Towers, which, although not specifically directed at the UK, nevertheless illustrated how real and significant the threat of attack was, and still remains today. Just last week, we had a soldier murdered in a terrorist attack on the streets of London outside his own barracks. The second issue was an emerging but growing body of evidence in relation to the effects of climate change and how extremes of weather could lead to major civil emergencies. And both of these are significant because at that stage in our development and following the end of the Cold War, the UK's civil protection arrangements had reduced considerably, to such an extent that we had a very loose civil protection infrastructure. And so there was a self-evident need for much greater resilience and greater capability to be able to deal with the growing number and growing complexity of risks that we face in a modern age. And ultimately, the only public agency able to deal with this new dimension of risk was the fire service. And this became an even greater issue following the terrorist attack in London a couple of years later, coinciding with our successful bid to host the Olympics in London in 2012. And the final issue relevant here reflected a further, but again a growing body of evidence from a relatively small number of pioneering fire brigades in the UK, and a report called Safe as Houses, published a few years earlier, that it was now becoming possible through the deployment of cheap technology, battery-operated smoke alarms, to make a real difference not only to the numbers of fires, but crucially to the numbers of fire deaths and injuries. I do recognise that this phenomenon of fire deaths in the home is not as significant for a number of delegates to the conference as it is in the UK, or was in the UK, but I do think it's worthwhile understanding how to understand our risk and how to understand the world around us in order to change that. And it's true to say that not everyone agreed with the proposition in the UK. In fact, at the time, there were a significant number of chiefs very sceptical about the impact and that it could be as significant as some people believe. Nevertheless, the National Review team were convinced, and so they made a number of key recommendations that subsequently formed the new approach and eventually became embedded in the new legislation I mentioned. So the key elements of the change encompassed 5 big themes. Firstly, a massive cultural shift so that everyone placed much greater emphasis on safety, prevention and partnership. And in support of this, utilised all of our resources to deliver this work, rather than seeing safety and prevention as something we could bolt on if we had spare time or spare resources. Secondly, a shift from providing blanket fire cover of fire appliances towards a risk assessment and risk management of a much wider range of emergencies, and a risk-based and differentiated emergency response. In other words, a shift from being fire brigades to fire and rescue services, and no longer just sending standard units or trucks and vehicles with a standard number of personnel, but providing very different responses to different emergencies. Thirdly, a shift to becoming a regulator of the built environment rather than a benign safety agency, with the consolidation of over 100 pieces of fire safety legislation into one comprehensive fire safety order. Fourth, a number of major changes in pay, terms and working conditions for staff, as a resolution to the industrial dispute I also mentioned earlier. And finally, a brand new approach to the way fire and rescue services should be governed at a local level, with a lot less direction from government and a lot more enabling power for local fire authorities. So we are now managing what we call the change of fire. Essentially, we now break up the component parts of the chain and we manage each of them through different but complementary and integrated approaches, and we call the whole approach integrated risk management planning. At the start, we seek to influence and change the behaviours that result in fires and emergencies, and we try preventing them in the truest sense of the word. However, we accept that there are limitations to this, and so we must also regulate and protect people in the built environment where they work and they take their leisure. But ultimately, things will still happen, and so we must continue to retain a high-quality emergency response service, but one that is proportionate to the risk and one that is also clear about returning the community to some sense of normality after a major event. Now, I shan't comment too much more on this shift now. I understand different speakers have addressed the conference over the years and explained a lot more about this. But I do just want to illustrate a couple of things that I think will be relevant to delegates for the conference. The first point is that we recognise that whilst we used to say fires can happen anytime and anywhere, and that remains true, it is a relative truth. Because what we have learned in the UK from using detailed analysis is that fires very often follow very clear and very discernible trends. So, whilst we may not be able to say precisely where a fire will occur and precisely when, we can make very accurate predictions about the areas and the times of the day. So not only does this enable us to plan our resource levels to match this operational demand, it also enables us to target our safety work. That said, we have also learned that big events and big fires do not in fact follow any particular trend or pattern. And the second thing to say is that this prevention really does work. We have seen huge reductions in every aspect of the calls to the service, and notwithstanding what I'm about to talk about next in relation to change, those downward trends continue, and our safety work continues. In fact, fires have fallen by over 50% in just less than a decade. This is a tremendous performance. And I love this quote from a report by an American company, Tridata, who in 2007 were commissioned to study community safety work across the globe and to provide a report to the US government. They said, there has been a sea change in the strategy used by the British Fire Service in the last few years that is just short of revolutionary. And every firefighter is now expected to participate and play a major role in community safety programs on top of their firefighting role. Huge endorsement. But of course, in 2007, we then had the financial crisis, and we are still living with its effects today. And as the impact has probably not been felt too hard by a number of the delegates of the conference, I think it's worth saying just a little bit more how big that challenge has been for us and just why it has propelled us to have to think in such radically different ways. I guess the point for delegates is that our experience is that innovation doesn't just happen of its own volition. Something needs to propel it forward or to drive it forward. When we emerged from the initial shock of the banking crisis, we started to really consider what it was likely to mean to us in coming years, and we realised that the effects would be truly profound. The financial predictions for a number of years got steadily worse and shifted from being 5, then 6 years of pain to 10 years. And now, really, there is no prospect of cuts to public services easing off in the next few years. Just on the news this morning, our Chancellor is talking about 2017 and 2018. In essence, the UK has spent its money on public services over the last 60 years or so in a fairly random way, but in a steadily growing way. And it's easy to see that for most of that period, even during the economic crises of the 1970s and 1980s, spending went up and down, but always overall in an upward trend. Then, from 1997 onwards, spending not only increased dramatically, but remained at that high level for a decade. This was unprecedented in our history, and it does not take an economist to work out that a correction was always going to be necessary, and that was before the banking crisis. So what does this mean in reality for the fire service? Well, so far, since 2010, we have absorbed a cut of over 25% in real terms, though it has had a bigger impact in the regional cities, and to a large extent, London was protected because of the 2012 Olympics. And we now know there is at least another 10% cut to come around 2015, and as I mentioned, almost certainly more cuts after that. So overall, a 30% cut in real budgets in less than 7 years. These are huge figures, and it's blindingly obvious to anybody that this requires a very different way of doing things in future. And this series of cuts builds on a decade of change, really the outcome of the review I mentioned earlier, with a major level of reduction in the number of frontline personnel already happening. In my own organisation, we've reduced the number of firefighters by 50% over that same decade. But of course, the risks we face haven't gone away, just because we've got funding challenges or just because we've got fewer personnel. If anything, the risks have got more complex, not less. There remains a terrorist threat. There remains the growing impact of climate change. Just last year in the UK, we had the coldest winter on record, immediately followed by the hottest and driest spring. And whilst we have reduced what we call our high demand incidents, such as dwelling fires, we still have big events. But the experience of our personnel in firefighting is reducing. And this massively increases the need for excellence and realism in training. There is a growing impact of technology, and in particular social media. Our last major incident was covered extensively on Twitter and Facebook. At its peak, we had over 1.7 million people following the trending incident, and it was covered in over 70 countries. And nowadays, our crews are being filmed either on YouTube or some other format from virtually the moment they leave the fire station. And this is fundamentally changing our level of accountability to the public as a service, but it's also changing the accountability of those of us in leadership positions. And as if that wasn't enough, natural disasters are increasing in their frequency and complexity. And as if that wasn't enough, the way new buildings are being built, with all the demands for faster and easier construction, and modularised construction to address our growing environmental concerns and challenges, all of these are having a huge effect on the fire missions. So we're now sending our firefighters to fight fires in what are effectively ovens with no thermostats. And this is very much the case with the type of construction faced by most of the delegates to the conference. And the combustibility of construction products and contents means that the time to flashover has reduced from 15 minutes in the 1950s and 60s to around just 3 minutes today, according to the latest research from the Nordic countries. And of course, we can't grow new land. So to deal with population growth, as well as other economic drivers and demands, the only way we can go is higher. And nowhere is that more apparent than the conference location and its surrounding areas. So around 2008 and 2009, we put all of this analysis and thinking together, and we started to look very differently at our future. We recognised that because of all these factors, we really had to redesign and reconfigure our whole approach to firefighting. So let me set out what the key components of our new approach are. Firstly, we have had to recognise that we must deal with a new financial reality. And whilst we have lobbied for greater funding, and we continue to do that, we still have to live within a new financial reality, both as a country and as a fire rescue service. Of course, we must still keep our personnel as safe, if not safer, than they have ever been, despite these new challenges. And we want to keep the community as safe as ever. Indeed, if possible, we want to reduce even further the level of damage or the cost of fire to our country, which is over £1 billion a year. So the only way we can do this, we have concluded, is by embracing and adapting new technology much more expansively. And technology, not just from the fire sector, but from other sectors as well. And we have accepted that we need to do this much more quickly than the previous approach we have taken to change. What does all this look like in practical terms? Well, we are in the throes of writing a new strategy to articulate the detail of this just now. And maybe you'll invite me back in the future to talk about that. But I will share some examples of the approach here. Let me start with call taking and mobilising or dispatching. We have now created a new organisation, and in fact we've created a new company jointly owned by 4 fire authorities that will shortly share responsibility for taking emergency calls, for mobilising appliances and for managing resources across the northwest of England. This goes live later this year, and the new centre covers a population of over 5 million people, dispatching hundreds of fire appliances. It will be the biggest mobilising centre in the UK and probably one of the biggest in the world. It will make extensive use of mobile data and mobile communications for every appliance and officer, and it will embrace all the benefits of the most up-to-date technology in terms of caller identification, geo-positioning of mobile telephones, and so on. It will really transform our whole approach to this key activity of taking emergency calls and responding with appliances. Now the even more exciting bit, incidents themselves. For many years we've used thermal imaging in the UK, but in large measure it has only been utilised after an incident to ensure that we had fully extinguished the fire and that there were no concealed hotspots. But in future, we will be moving the use of this technology to the mainstream of tactical decision-making during an incident and deploying state-of-the-art thermal scanning. So, as our officers approach buildings or incidents in the future, not only will they be looking around them and collecting their thoughts and information as they have always done, but they will also now be thermally scanning the building with handheld thermal scanners to establish what is happening in a much more scientific way, and then developing their initial firefighting tactics based upon science and knowledge rather than just experience and intuition. And these tactics will also be very different in future. To illustrate the importance of this change, I often liken the complex nature of firefighting today to complex surgery. And can you imagine a surgeon undertaking a major operation without the benefit of X-rays or MRI scans? So they have an idea of what they're going to find once they go into the complex machine that is the human body. Thermal scanning starts to bring that level of technical support to our decision making to help deal with the complexities of the kind of buildings and risks that we face today in the fire and rescue service. So on to tactics, because once a commander understands much better the thermal behaviour and thermal dynamics of a building on fire and the environment they're dealing with, they can then decide to change the environment rather than just accept it. And in doing so, dramatically reduce the risks and make it safer and quicker for personnel to enter. And this is where a cold cutting attack comes in, because there is now the ability to cut into a building with water and to make an initial attack without entering the oven that I described earlier. In other words, using ultra high pressure water lances to go straight through the wall or the door, the window, the roof, the floor, wherever, and inject an ultra fine but very high pressure water mist into the compartment on fire. And I understand delegates are going to hear more about water misting technology shortly. But this has a very dramatic and dynamic impact in reducing the temperature and removing the risk of flashover of backdraft. Typically, it's possible to reduce the temperature from 700 degrees or higher to around 100 degrees in less than a minute, and with just 50 litres of water. And the incident commander will continue to scan the building thermally, so they know rather than guess when the cold cutting attack has been effective. And they can then make a much more balanced decision for crews to enter, but not crawling on the floor, deploying gas cooling tactics as we do now. This use of cold cutting is, I believe, a game-changing phenomenon, and nowhere more so than in tackling high-rise building fires. And I believe you will hear much more about this in future. So back to the tactics. Once the building is cooler, crews can then deploy tactical ventilation and positive pressure ventilation fans before then entering the building and sweeping it quickly to finally extinguish the fire. And probably also utilising hands-free, helmet-mounted and personal thermal image cameras as part of this approach. So in future, we believe that not only will we extinguish fires much more quickly, it will be much safer for the crews and the public. We will use a lot less water with a lot less damage, and it will all be enabled by using tried and trusted technology. And it may well be technology that has not been used in this sector or in this joined-up, coordinated way before, but it is used extensively elsewhere in other sectors. And when deployed together in this way, fundamentally changes our whole approach to firefighting. I could say a lot more about the use of other technologies, water management systems that can be operated remotely, unmanned drones as part of information gathering and command and control, and so on. But these are still very much at conceptual stage as opposed to the examples I have used, which we are deploying now, not in some distant future. So let me close this paper with a brief outline of where exactly we are with this. We have now bought the new PPV fans, and we are in the middle of training the whole organisation in our new approach to tactical ventilation. We will tender for the cold cutting equipment in the next few days and the thermal scanning equipment shortly. And we roll out this training for all personnel at the end of this year, with the installation of equipment on all appliances complete by the end of next year. The new control centre will also be live later this year. And I've only briefly touched on the retraining and the cultural challenges of this redesign of the service, because we could fill a whole session talking about that, and maybe next year that would also be a good session to give, especially if we've been successful. But in truth, this cultural change of getting firefighters and fire officers to understand and then to trust and use the technology and science skillfully is probably a bigger issue than getting the technology in the first place. And so excellent research, development and training are crucial to success. But also crucial is a clear strategy and a compelling sense of leadership. So what do we take from all this? Well, a big lesson to me is that budget challenges are tough, but they are not necessarily disaster, and they can provide a burning platform for thinking differently and more innovatively about how you do what you do, but how you do it differently and how you do it better. Maybe there are different drivers for innovation in the UAE. But we also believe that by thinking early and by being prepared to break new ground, in other words, pioneering, and being prepared to accept high quality research and science and embrace technology rather than fear it, we will be able to address both our financial challenges that we face as well as our operational challenges in a way that we couldn't even imagine just a few years ago. Hopefully you found that relatively brief outline and overview of where we are in Greater Manchester informative, and I'd be happy to take any questions, and I hope the technology has managed to hold up as well. Thank you very much.
Steve, thank you very much, and I'm sitting to the back of the room so you can see me and the audience. While you were speaking, and thank you for such a great speech, we had some live questions come in on Twitter. So if it's okay, I'll take a few minutes with you and we can basically go through some of the questions. I'll take about 3, if that's okay. So the first question I have from one of our streamers is, on the future of firefighting, how effective really is cold cutting equipment in reducing the temperature, and how much does it use?
Thank you very much. Well, it is incredibly effective. The test that we have done, the graphs are very stark. They indicate effectively falling off a cliff. It's that quick. It depends upon the thickness of the material that it's cutting through, but that normally takes seconds. Once through, it drops dramatically. And I say typically in our test, we've dropped it from 700 or even 800 degrees down to about 100, so that it's safe enough for firefighters to walk into the building rather than have to crawl through. I should also add that our research illustrates that if you use more than one lance, then it's actually not quite twice as effective, but it's more effective. Because this is such new technology, we're still very much experimenting with its benefits and its opportunities, but it is incredibly effective.
Very good. I have another question for you from one of our live streamers. What kind of tools or computer systems did you use to analyze the data about fires and to develop risk models?
We've used a number of companies in the UK, a company called Process Evolution, a company called Active Solutions, but we've very much built, I suppose, models using a combination of software programs, and we've also been able to tap into the use of data on population census type of data. So in effect, we've just linked together in this integrated and planned way a variety of computer systems. And in the end, of course, it comes back to the professional judgment of people like me. Because one of the things about innovation, by definition, it's new. It's never been done before. So one of the challenges we had was everybody wanted hard evidence, evidence-based decision-making. Before you take this step forward, where's the evidence and proof that it's going to work? And of course, data, as important as it is, and modelling, as important as that is, only takes you so far. In the end, my point in my speech, ultimately it comes back to leadership.
Very good. I'm going to take one last question from online, and our final one for you today, Steve, is who regulates buildings for fire safety, and is this done in accordance with any building codes?
There are two ways that works in the UK, and this is my point about in the past, it was a very complex set of public agencies that were regulating the built environment. As a consequence of changes in the early 2000s, all that's been brought together in one broad piece of fire safety legislation. So effectively, at the construction stage, it is local authorities, local councils, municipalities that regulate the construction of buildings, including the fire safety component. Once the buildings are occupied, it's the fire and rescue service that accepts all that responsibility, but we do it on a risk basis. So we have reinspection programs and we have powers of prosecution and powers to take legal action in the event that we believe that somebody infringes that legislation. So largely speaking, when they're occupied, it's the fire and rescue service.
Very good. Steve, I want to thank you on behalf of the forum today for joining us this morning. I know you had to get up quite early. I saw you with your coffee cup there. I hope you'll join us next year. We're going to get 3D glasses and put you 3D. How about that?
That's a scary thought, I'm afraid, from this end.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate it, and have a great day.
Thank you very much indeed. Hope delegates have found that interesting.
Thank you.